Well, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name's Jennifer Chirico. I'm the Associate Vice President of Sustainability, Georgia Tech, and really excited to be here today. I think this is an important conference and looking at the interdisciplinary approaches as it relates to sustainability is so key to success. So I want to introduce our panelists. We have Ellen Bassett, Professor and Dean of the College of Design in the center. Michael Oxman, Professor of the Practice and Managing Director of Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business. And Anjali Thomas, Associate Professor of the School of International Affairs. So you can see we have a little diverse panel from different groups and different schools. And I want to start by sharing a little bit about my experience in the interdisciplinary realm. So I started my college education at Georgia Tech in the 90s, and I focused on management and finance. And that was my first job in finance. And one of the things that I noticed right away was it lacked the human part. You know, you go in and it's all about making money. When I went into the field at Georgia Tech, I was like in the investments committee, we're doing all these fun things. So you don't really see that aspect of it. Once I got in, I was like, they don't care about people or what happens to people from all of these things. And they didn't care about the environment either. I mean, green investing was not a thing then. And I left and I knew I wanted to figure out something else to do for my life. And I ended up in New Zealand and I ended up taking all of these I was at these sustainability retreats, but it was all on the environment. And so that was another great learning point where I was learning about the environmental aspects of things, right? How do you grow healthy food? How do you build sustainable buildings? And it was kind of the first time I'd heard the word sustainability. I'd never heard about it at Tech in the 90s. And that was real eye-opening to me as well. And then I ended up going into public health. I did my master's in public health. My focus was environmental health, but that was all about people. It was that social aspect and I took my first sustainability class where Ellen was teaching in Portland, Oregon. This was in 2002, my first sustainability class. It was at the urban planning in Portland. And I was sold. I was like, this makes sense. If something finally made sense to me, because it was how the environment connected with people, and also, and to me, I had the finance background, so I was like, and you have to have the financial piece to make it work. And so that was kind of my beginning of my journey into sustainability, and I continue to say why it is so important to look at these different aspects. I still come across people and they'll only talk about the environmental piece. And it's kind of like they leave out the financial, but especially at a university, we have to always be thinking about how we're going to make things work. We are a public institution, right? And businesses, to stay in business, they have to still make it work. But we cannot leave out the people component. I mean, we are here to support human beings and people around the world and making sure that we're creating a healthy environment for people. So when Stuart asked me to do this panel, I was like, this is perfect. And Michael said, I don't know if it's a good fit for me. And I was like, it's perfect because these three components, focusing on the built environment, focusing on the social aspect, and focusing on the building aspect, to me, these are the cornerstones of sustainability. And meeting all of these and recognizing how they interplay is the key to success in these areas. And I've seen that over and over and over again. So I'm thrilled to have this amazing panel. And I want to start by giving them a chance to give an introduction about their journey and sustainability. So I'm going to start with Anjali. And if each of you could share a little bit about your journey, what brought you to sustainability, and how it has impacted your perspective on its overall relevance. So.
Hey, can everyone hear me without the mic? Okay, okay.
Virtual, just the mic.
Oh. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so for me, my journey into sustainability is really through being a scholar of global development. So I grew up in India and, just with growing up there and with everything I saw around me, I've always had a passion for understanding the drivers of well-being, of disadvantage, of inequalities in well-being and access and disadvantage. When it comes to sustainability, my interest in sustainability has sort of grown from that perspective. You know, it's these days it's really hard to think about well-being anywhere without thinking of environmental sustainability. So whether we're talking about exposure to air pollution and how that affects health and well-being, or the impacts of drought and water scarcity on gender disparities, or the ways in which deforestation shapes inequities within communities, we really see that the questions of environmental sustainability and global development are really inextricably linked. And when it comes to governments and policymakers, so I'm a political scientist by training, and again, it's really hard to understand the decisions of governments and policymakers in terms of how they, shape environmental outcomes or react to conditions of environmental scarcity without understanding the interplay of global development, social and political factors, and sustainability. So that's really kind of how I came to thinking about sustainability from the perspective of concern and interest in understanding, the drivers of well-being, and thinking about how environmental sustainability is really kind of so interlinked with that.
Just move down the line here. Just move down the line.
Yeah.
Wait.
There we are. We're on. Okay. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. This is terrific. And it's always great to get out of my office and not have another meeting and get a chance to actually meet people who are doing work that's research oriented. I guess if we're calling this the road to sustainability, for me, what really matters and in my story is the issue of place. And in my field, we talk a lot about place and place attachment. Again, where I grew up was really instrumental. I grew up in Metro Detroit in the 1970s. And this was a period, if you know anything about the history of Detroit, not quite the beginning of the end, but it was definitely a culmination of some really long, difficult things within that city. And it was really a time of deindustrialization, of job losses, lots of racial stress between the suburbs and the cities, a lot of people moving out, sort of the parallel to the city of Atlanta in many ways of its sort of racial history, and a lot of disappearing farmlands and rising poverty and a lot of really kind of raucous politics. And so I'm a teenager in this period trying to understand what's going on in my city, what's going on in my metro. And I came very, very interested in issues of job generation, right? And addressing poverty. And so I went into planning because I wanted to create jobs. I had this idea that, with the right public policies and investments and technology and training people that we can, take those laid off auto workers and really find them ways to have new jobs, new careers, and more prosperity for what is a really distressed city, right? The city of Detroit. So with that, I went into urban planning, did economic development, worked for Tommy Thompson at one point in the state of Wisconsin Department of Development. That was interesting. But I always have wanderlust, like severe wanderlust. And I went to Africa after I graduated with my master's degree. And I have to say, Africa is probably the most transformative experience of my life. When I was studying economic development planning, I really had a jobs versus the environment kind of mentality, right? In this sense that, all these regulatory restrictions, they're killing the auto industry. All these sort of things are really, if we want people to have good jobs, we don't necessarily have to have a good environment. Well, when I went to East Africa, the first thing that happens is you fall in love with the landscape. You fall in love with the ecology. You fall in love with like this place. And it became really evident to me that in fact, it wasn't a jobs versus environment, but in fact, for East Africa to advance economically, socially, politically, it's the natural resource base and the people, right, were really critical to having those in sync in order to have economic growth. And so I was very focused, because I'm an urban planner, on the city, which we all know, if you any economist in the room will tell you that cities are economic engines for the country, right? Most of our GDP comes from cities. So how we develop our cities, how we use our land, how we invest in infrastructure, how we think about equity in our landscape is totally critical to having a truly sustainable society. And I like the just, equitable, and sustainable society, which I think is, I don't know, it's at Robert Wood Johnson or which foundation has that as their term. And so that's kind of what motivates me in my field and with my college when we think about our role. At least 3 of our schools look at the built environment. that we have to be thinking about the built environment as like an incredible locus for, achieving a good environment, a just economy, but having people create places where people flourish. And that's really what we try to do in our teaching and in our work.
I think I've got it.
You had it. Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Better? Hi. So I'm Michael Oxman. I'm with the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business. And so my journey into sustainability, speaking of wanderlust, I started off with an interest in U.S.-Soviet relations my last year of high school. I promise you I won't give you an account of every year since high school. But I found it interesting. I went to college and had a professor who this was his thing. There was maybe two of us who were also interested in Russian studies. I think there were 2 or 3 of us who graduated with that degree. And the reason I was interested in it is because I had this idealistic notion about, what's the deal with these missiles being pointed across at each other, ICBMs, and can't we just talk to each other and get along? And so I sort of went down that path as a result of that sense of idealism. I stayed with international affairs and skipping through, I did political risk insurance for a while, focused on the former Soviet Union. And then ultimately, I found myself with Pricewaterhouse in Kazakhstan. And at that time, this was 94 to 97-ish. At that time, the work that Pricewaterhouse was doing was essentially leveraging the work that USAID had done on mass privatization across the former Soviet Union, which didn't work out so well. But most of Pricewaterhouse's work was with oil and gas companies and mining companies. So so I got introduced to that industry. And I have to say, I found it absolutely intellectually fascinating. It had everything. I mean, it had drama, it had the international stuff, it had high stakes, it had everything that, one could be fascinated by. Over time, however, and I started doing something I was not qualified to do, which was financial modeling for some of these huge multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. And so I learned a lot about the industry and its drivers, through that experience. However, it started to dawn on me that, there was a whole bunch of value being left on the table by these companies, i.e. from the political, social, and environmental perspectives. They were not taking care of these issues in a way that was productive for themselves. It was counterproductive. And so that caught my attention. So I got involved in what we were calling at the time above ground risk, which was as distinguished from subsurface risk, where the hydrocarbons are and so forth. And from that experience, that's where I began to really appreciate the societal impacts that the industry, not just the oil and gas and mining industries, but those industries in particular were having. And so long story short, I ended up in Kazakhstan another time. And after I was repatriated to the US, I resigned and went to work for a nonprofit business organization based out of San Francisco called Business for Social Responsibility, where I directed their energy and extractives advisory services practice. And most of the work that we were doing was focused on social license to operate, i.e., how do these companies gain community acceptance for these multi-billion-dollar projects that have the potential to provide enormous local benefits, putting climate change aside for the moment. So I did that for a number of years before coming to tech, and I've been here about 7.5 years. So I really, for me, my introduction to sustainability, I forgot to say in the very beginning, when I was also doing Russian studies, I vowed I would never, ever, under any circumstances, go into business. And here I am, many years later. And I think I've been torn over the many years of my career between sort of this sense of idealism and what we can potentially achieve together, and pragmatism that the business culture teaches you. And I still haven't resolved that tension. So ask me if you're interested anyway, 10 years from now, and see if I've maybe come to a resolution. Anyway, that's my background, and I'm sticking to it.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks everyone for sharing. Really, I learned a lot about all of you today. That was interesting backgrounds and very diverse, interdisciplinary for everyone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask questions to each of them and then let them build off of each other of how it connects with what they're doing with the social aspect, business, and design aspect. So I'm going to start with Ellen. And Ellen, can you discuss how sustainable design is critical in both urban and rural communities across the globe and how they may require different approaches?
Sure, just a small question. Well, first, I just want to say, since I have a captive audience, I think the College of Design is one of the least understood entities on the entire campus. It seems like people think we run around with pencils and we draw and maybe we cut things out of cardboard and create things, and we stare at images and think about what the platonic, ideal is for a rectangle, and while that there are people who do that, we are an incredibly diverse college, right? And so, we have tons of engineers, humanities people, social scientists. Certainly we have architects, we have designers, we have people who have MFAs, we have composers, we have roboticists, so we're really, really diverse. We have more accreditation entities than any other college on campus because of our diversity. So I say that because when you think about sustainable places and designing, it's not just an image, it's not just a physical thing that we're thinking about. We are thinking in the College of Design about, let's call it all three legs of the stool, right? We're really thinking about what's happening physically, what's in the environment, what are we building, what kind of cities are we envisioning, what kind of buildings are we envisioning, what kind of places are we creating, urban or rural. But we're also thinking about, what does it mean economically? How do you get there? How do you think about the structure of markets and regulation and incentives in order to have these places come to fruition? And we're certainly thinking about the humans, right? And how humans are essentially part of any drive to get to sustainability. So in some ways, I think the processes of thinking about sustainability, whether it's urban or rural, are essentially the same, right? I mean, I think one thing that we prioritize very heavily in the College of Design, and this would make Jenny Hirsch smile, is participation by communities, right? That we need to work with communities to understand them, what their aspirations are. And then you as a designer or a builder or a city planner can work with them to help figure out, how do we use the tools of government? How do we use business? How do we use markets? How do we use private and public investment in order to get us to that end goal, right? And so what I think is exciting about, we just focused on sustainable communities, is that it takes every part of your brain and every part of your skill set to really think about and do sustainability well. So yes, I want to produce fine designers who can build wonderful Candida-like buildings. I also want to have city planners who say, well, what's the policy environment that enables us to build a Candida-like building and then scale it up so that it's available for people who are earning 30% of area median income, right? So we are really trying to build a very well-rounded, let's call it designer, for lack of a better word, because we've embraced that word, who understand all of those sort of aspects that are important for sustainability. So what we do bring to the table in terms of, concrete technical skills, I would say are, yes, we have an understanding of buildings and materials and building performance, and we have an understanding of policy environments that help you move things forward, right? We think a lot about the use of data in order to inform public decision-making. But ultimately, what I'd like to say, that anything that a designer does requires that we understand like all of the three types of expertise that are at this table. So I always tell people that people who, especially urban planners, we're like a mile wide and an inch deep. I can talk to you about just about anything, right? Just don't push me super hard, right? I can talk to you about carbon markets, but not really well, but I understand fundamentally things about carbon markets because I need to understand those things in order for my transportation planning ideas to move forward, right? So I don't know if I've actually answered the question, but that is sort of, again, what's your line? That's my answer and I'm sticking to it. That's it.
That's great. Thank you, Ellen. So Anjali, based off of what Ellen said, how do you see social and political context shape how sustainable design is realized and implemented? You can talk about the urban versus rural, because I know you mentioned that before, but
Sure, yeah. So I think Ellen kind of framed the issues perfectly because I think that, one reason why social and political context matters, and that's something we think a lot about as, political scientists, is because oftentimes, even if we know what the right approach is, to maximize or optimize environmental sustainability, the approach often doesn't get adopted, right, because of humans, right? So we know from, a lot of research in social science that citizens often know what the sustainable choice is, but don't make it because we fall prey to collective action problems or free rider problems, or we face information asymmetries when it comes to choosing the most energy efficient choice. We tend to consider more immediate benefits rather than far off gains. We, succumb to the norms of our own affinity groups, which may or may not actually support environmental sustainability. And then for policymakers, right, they often don't choose the right policies to achieve environmental sustainability. And I see this obviously through the lens of political science, but often this is because of political constraints and incentives, right? So just one example, money in politics, right? So as we know in the US, right, the role of oil and gas companies is really well known. And, it's been very well documented, actually, with studies that use actually campaign contribution data to show that the more a given member of Congress votes against environmental policies, the more contributions they receive from oil and gas companies, right? So that's just one example. And that's just not just limited to the US, right? So India, which is the context that I study, right, there's research that's showing the politicians actually use their influence over bureaucrats to facilitate environmental clearances of things like thermal power plants, even though they would, wreak kind of environmental havoc because, they want to get in good with these project developers to get kickbacks. Right. And the kickbacks in turn are a source of campaign finance, which they need to run in these increasingly very competitive elections. So I think these are just some ways in which, social and political contexts create barriers, and that, that the design piece is really important to know kind of what, the design and the technology and the engineering piece is really important to know kind of what would best promote sustainability, but then we need to understand often, why this doesn't happen in practice. And that's where I think the social and political contexts really make a difference.
thanks, Anjali. And it's really interesting to think about in the, bringing up the oil and gas, and Michael can speak to that as well, but because we know that there are health outcomes from using oil and gas, right? And we know this on our campus, all throughout Atlanta. We have high rates of asthma. There's all kinds of issues, yet businesses often lobby against it. So, or against decreasing the use of it. So Michael, after hearing from both of them, can you share your thoughts on how these affect business sustainability and what businesses can do to make sure that they are designing sustainably?
Absolutely. And let me just real quickly on the oil and gas industry. The primary reason why I left the industry was because of its social and environmental impacts. And so I had transitioned away from that before coming to tech. Yet there's a bunch of lessons learned from my time there. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to answer this question. I've got about 3 or 4 directions I want to go in at the same time. So I'm stalling. I guess the word that comes to mind after listening to my 2 colleagues here on the panel is holistic. And in business, by the way, business is a social science. We're just not very social, and we don't always follow the science. However, having said that, there's the social dimensions in business are, are enormous, right? I mean, business is about exchange of goods and services among people. And the idea is for the institution of business to benefit everyone, not just to benefit a few. So we haven't got that right, that's for sure. And for some of the reasons that have been mentioned thus far. So I see that as the bad news. The good news is, in my view, if we're thinking about what is happening holistically in the business world, the word sustainability and the movement around sustainability has taken on more traction than it ever had in the past. So there's now an ecosystem. When I first got into the sustainability world, there was, companies were talking about doing their sustainability reports. The CEO said, we're just misunderstood. If we speak more slowly and we show more pictures and tell better stories, we'll be better understood and people will accept us. It's evolved from the point to the point now where you have investors, and not just impact investors who are interested in social and environmental issues, but also ESG investors who recognize that addressing social and environmental challenges is good for the business as well and good for their returns. So you've got this, and you've got customers demanding sustainability, you have investors demanding sustainability. It's not just NGOs who demand sustainability, but they of course are still incredibly important players in this space and they keep us honest. So I think from this holistic picture that is emerging of sustainability across these different institutions, I think is promising. The question in my mind is, are we going to do it fast enough? We're certainly not going to do it fast enough for the current generation, whether we're talking about climate change or whether we're talking about human rights or whether we're talking about equity. We have a long way to go, and business is both part of the problem and hopefully part of the solution. The other sort of strand here, and then I'll stop. I don't want to talk too long, is that, within the different industries, I mean, if you're talking about the built environment, for example, you have in a lot more companies and developers who are interested in LEED certifications. And if you're talking about forestry, there's the Forest Stewardship Council and the certifications that they offer. So and I could go through every single manufacturers are addressing circular economy. All of the industries are having to address DEI and equity more broadly. Not necessarily doing it well, but it's certainly on their list of priorities. There was one more point I was going to make. Oh, the other point I just wanted to mention about, again, I'm an optimist sometimes, and I'm a pessimist the rest of the time. So you'll hear me talk out of both sides of my mouth. But when we were talking about the oil and gas industry and its hypocrisy of talking a good game in its sustainability programming and wanting to reduce emissions and also address human rights and that sort of thing, and then yet donating to politicians who are advocating for the exact opposite. We are seeing a movement now that our centers be loosely affiliated with, and I hope there'll be more of it, around corporate political responsibility, which are a set of principles that came out of the Herb Institute at the University of Michigan that is aiming to do just that. It's aiming to say, you can't have it both ways. If this is what you're espousing from a sustainability perspective, then your advocacy needs to match that. And if it doesn't, you need to be able to transparently explain why. Anyway, that was a bit of a ramble. I have no idea if I answered the question, and I don't remember the original question.
Yeah, well, I think one of the key pieces is having that holistic perspective, and that is coming more into business today. And it's not necessarily that they're choosing to that; it's that they have to do that to stay in business, right? So that's a big distinction that's happened over the last 20, 25 years, and a good thing. So I'm going to turn it to Anjali. If you can share, what are the key findings in social science that help advance our understanding of sustainability?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously there's a lot of work in the social sciences increasingly on sustainability. So I probably won't be able to speak to a lot of it, but I can speak to some of it that's kind of most directly related to my research. So I would say, one kind of strand of the literature and scholarship in the social sciences thinks about what are the impacts of climate change, and not just, of course, on, health and, all the kind of sort of more physical things. But one really concrete finding that's emerged from a lot of work in political science and economics is the impact of climate change on conflict. So whether whether it's kind of civil war, all-out civil war, to smaller scale conflict, to even individual level crime, one of the most robust findings in social science is the link between, climate change induced kind of weather shocks and the occurrence and intensity of conflict. So some of my research that's actually now a little bit old, but it was one of the early works where me and my co-author, we looked at Hindu-Muslim riots in India, which are usually considered to be, social phenomena, product of cultural and, kind of ethnic rivalries and strife and differences. And we showed that these riots are very strongly kind of driven by rainfall shocks. And, temporary rainfall shocks actually have a major impact on the occurrence of these riots. And the reason we show is because, rainfall, obviously, especially, this was in the 80s and 90s in India, has, had a big kind of role to play with regard to economic growth because, of agricultural dependence. People's livelihoods were dependent on rainfall. And then, of course, is translated to other kinds of markets as well. And then this really influenced, economic conditions, which in turn spurred on conflict. And, this is just one piece of a lot of different research that really kind of, highlights this real urgency in terms of dealing with climate change. Another kind of aspect of the kinds of questions that social scientists ask and try to answer is, how do governments and policymakers and citizens react to conditions of kind of environmental and resource scarcity? And again, one of the big findings is that, that often scarcity, it is environmental, but oftentimes it is created by political and social conditions. So in some of my work ongoing right now, we're looking at water access in informal settlements in Mumbai, India. And we look at how, even though, there are kind of droughts and, there is some amount of water scarcity, we really show that that this is really a product of politicians and bureaucrats' incentives not to provide regular piped water to informal settlements. And we actually work with NGOs to design interventions to empower citizens to actually put pressure on bureaucrats and politicians to compel them to provide piped water. And right now, our preliminary results show that those interventions actually work. So, and worked actually, so they actually resulted in an increase in piped water in the informal settlements that got those interventions. And so these are just some ways of understanding, that things are often framed as scarcity and environmental scarcity. And, often bureaucrats and politicians will say, well, we can't give water to settlements because of scarcity. It's oftentimes a product of, kind of political and economic interest, I would say. So that's just some examples kind of related to my own work. But of course, there's a lot more that I won't ramble on.
Thank you, Anjali. That brings up a really interesting component that we've been talking about a good bit. So if anyone hasn't heard, we've started doing these climate fresque workshops, and they're based on the IPCC, and they get into the whole science. So it's like a fun game that you play over 3 hours where you work as a group and you learn about all of the science behind climate change. And so when it starts really with human-made activities, and what humans are doing. And then it gets through everything. But and then it gets to the consequences. And one of the big consequences at the end is armed conflict. And that's one of the ones they just added that this year. It was not in that. And because there are so many more conflicts happening today related to climate change, drought, floods, starvation, mining, there's countless. And a lot of this does connect back to business and political decisions, right? That also affect people. They affect buildings. Even right here at Georgia Tech, we've had flooding, we've had other issues, right, in our buildings. Some of people have been put out of their buildings in the last year. So we're really trying to look at those and have a more sustainable campus. But I want to turn it to Michael, and I want to ask, kind of connecting this to business. And let me just give one quick background. Did anyone know Brian Norton, who was in the School of Public Policy? Valerie knew him, people. So he was my dissertation chair, and I have so much respect for him. He was doing sustainability and he was writing about adaptive management back in the 90s, and I learned so much from him. But one of the things that I've carried over the years is that holistic approach that he really emphasized. But he had this spectrum of sustainability that he said that we used in society, kind of unknowingly. And it was kind of like, you don't do anything. And then the second one I remember was business, or he called it economic sustainability. And that was really about business. And we only look into the future 5 years or so to make decisions financially for businesses, because sometimes you don't know if you're going to stay in business, you're trying to make a profit. And so like, 5 years was kind of the general mark of like, oh, we need to do this. Well, how will it produce profit in the next 5 years? And you're not really thinking about how is this going to affect people 20 years down the road? We look at all the chemicals in all of our products and other types of things like that. They're not really looking at that as much, or they weren't. And then it gets into more of, I forgot the third tier, but it was something sustainability, which is kind of more of the balance of looking out to like 20 years from now. And that was really where I sat with like thinking, every decision we make, we should be thinking 20 years in advance. So with our climate action plan, that's where we're looking 25 years in advance. Where can we, we have upfront capital costs, but we want to achieve savings. We want to have a cleaner, healthier campus. So how do we do that? And then the fourth tier was normative sustainability. So that was like the most extreme, like do not do anything to harm the earth in any way, which is really almost impossible in our society today. But kind of getting back to that question of long-term versus short-term sustainability in business, I think is a key aspect, because I still see that focus on short-term. And even now they're still kind of focusing on short-term because people are asking for it and the market's demanding it. So my question to you, Michael, is how are you seeing businesses address kind of those upfront costs needed for sustainability from a short-term perspective versus a long-term? And are they really considering that long-term perspective?
Wow.
That was a big question. I know.
Yeah,
That was a lot.
big question. So I guess in my own experience, what I've seen is that when I teach on this subject, I'll ask the students, what motivates companies? What gets them going? And the answer is normally something about profits, right? And I'll say, well, when do profits? What causes that focus on profits? And by profits, I mean short-term profits. And ultimately, they'll come out and say, well, they're quarterly earnings reports. They have to report out to all these institutional investors and analysts and so forth who have put pressure on them. And then that pressure and how they do in those quarterly earnings affects all of their shareholders, right? So the pressure is just mutually reinforcing. At the same time, if you step back for a minute and you ask yourself, well, isn't the purpose of short-term profit to maximize shareholder value? And in reality, shareholder value is achieved not in quarters, it is achieved over the long term. And as soon as they start making that connection, then the time horizon becomes, longer. The consideration becomes longer. And as the consideration becomes longer, sustainability naturally becomes part of the equation and the issues within sustainability. So, and then there's also there's sort of an academic debate about, are we talking about shareholder capitalism? Are we talking about stakeholder capitalism? And increasingly, stakeholder capitalism is getting some support. Even the Business Roundtable, which is a national collection of some of the largest companies in the country, multinationals and so forth, even they changed their definition of what they're focused on from shareholder capitalism to a form of stakeholder capitalism, where they actually name the stakeholders that companies should be considering at the same level as shareholders. Now, in reality, is that actually happening? There's still a very high degree of short-termism in business. So as a business school, I think one of the things that we can do is teach students to think about the long term. Also think about, to Jennifer's point, how what you do in the short term impacts both the long-term viability of your business, but also the health and welfare of human beings. And I have to step back, and there was a couple of comments that were made earlier. One about water, because it reminded me of an experience that I had many years ago when I was involved in helping a company in Papua New Guinea, actually, with this ginormous project. They were addressing the community. We were just off to the side as consultants. And the community relations folks were all drawn from the community. They were all experts on their community, and they were experts on the project. They were fantastic. Instead, this person comes in from, he's an uppity up from somewhere else, and the corporation didn't know the local environment. We're standing on a beach in Papua New Guinea, and people are living with no infrastructure. I mean, they're in huts. There's no nearby fresh water. There's no electricity. It's terrible conditions. And this company is about to spend big money. So one of the community folks stands up and says, what is your company going to do about giving us fresh water? And the person says, he just ignored the question, essentially. He didn't even bother to respond. So the other questions, and this guy comes back and asks the question again. And he gave a very short answer, again, not fully addressing the question. Finally, the guy comes back and says, what are you going to do about fresh water? And he's holding a water bottle, and he tosses it to the guy and says, you want fresh water? There's your fresh water. So I make that point only because some people shouldn't be talking to other people. No, I'm saying that facetiously. But the point is, that's an extreme example, but we have to teach our students how to collaborate, how to work with other people, whether you're in business, whatever institution you may be working in. That's what we're trying to do. One of the things that we're trying to do at the Ray C. Anderson Center. So we have a collaborative group of about 65 companies that are working together to try to get the state of Georgia to net zero, and also supporting a transition to net zero emissions that is also equitable. And I could talk more about that, but I'll stop there. Did I answer the question?
No, that's great. And, just in terms of water, I think that we could talk all day about water, right? And the health impacts, the environmental impacts. I mean, it's one of the biggest issues in the world related to climate change and getting clean, fresh water. And it's one of the biggest causes of disease too, right? Polluted water. So, and health issues. So thank you, Michael, for sharing that. And I'm going to pass it to Ellen to kind of respond to that. But Ellen, in your opinion, what are the most important social science aspects to consider in urban and rural design? And maybe how does that connect with that short-term versus long-term view when we're talking about design?
So in some ways, I'm going to repeat a bit of what Anjali has said, to be honest. So, I mean, I've been working kind of in the field of, international development, city and regional planning since the, late 80s. And I have to say that when people say, oh, we didn't know about climate change, oh, these questions of sustainability, I roll my eyes. I'm just like, oh, give me a break. We have known for a very long time. And we've also known for a very long time what we need to do to design better communities, to design better places to live that are, not land consumptive, that enable people to move throughout the landscape with, low carbon emissions, multimodal transit. We know how to build housing that lowers carbon footprints. We know that we need to build more densely. We know that we need to think about cities as places that can be regenerative, where we also don't just kind of suck resources, but we also can provide our own, food and water and all these sort of things, right? We know what to do. That is not the barrier. The technology isn't really the barrier. The barrier is adoption, right? The barrier is saying, get out of your car, get into a bike and bike to work, right? How many of you drove in your own cars today? I want to shame everybody. Oh, this is a really good audience. Only 3 people. Fabulous. Okay. Yeah, I did say it because I biked to work this morning, but I can bike to work because I can afford to live close enough, right, that I can bike to work. We've set up our built environment in so many ways not to enable us to achieve the type of sustainability outcomes we need. So this is where social sciences, business, public policy are so instrumental to moving forward, right? We have to have the incentive systems both positive, let's kind of cajole people or bribe them, is what I like to say, to do the right thing. We need to have the regulations, the sticks to make people do the right things. We need to understand human behavior and frame people to make decisions that are easy, that they don't have to like really agonize over it, to make sustainability simple, right? And so the social sciences and having businesses do the right thing so that I don't have to stare at the cereal aisle or think, can I buy an orchid? I bought orchids recently for my recently promoted professors. I'm like, is there some terrible like thing about mass orchid growing that I don't know about, and I'm going to be shamed by giving orchids to people, right? You know,
I said the same thing about orchids. I don't know.
so I want to just make, so what we need in the engineering design side of things is to have the policy environment, the social incentives, the business and pricing mechanisms work so that people can be sustainable. And so when early on, I started to work with somebody I taught many moons ago at Michigan State, and we were trying to get a ballot measure passed to do a major funding for the purchase of conservation easements and creating green infrastructure trails and doing set-asides and land protection. And none of these ideas are new. You just get people to go and vote for them, right? And so I was working with a psychologist around this thing called the theory of planned behavior. Like, how do we get people to be in the right circles? How to message? Who do they look to when they're getting information and how they're making decisions about voting, right? And so we were spending a lot of time thinking about what's our campaign around this, and can we use the insights from really, public choice theories, political science, psychology to get this thing passed. That isn't your average designer's wheelhouse, right? They know what to do and they can give you the beautiful image of what we should be building, but we need the social sciences, we need the economics, we need the business community in order to achieve this. And we also need, and this goes back to we have disinformation that actively stops people from making the right choices. And, so the idea of what the oil and gas industry, they've been funding junk science for years. They've been planting doubts about climate change, right? This is really exciting. That's what you're talking about with Michigan and this sort of idea of trying to really call people out. Without humans being really its center, we're never going to move forward in sustainability. I also have to give a shout out for law. I mean, we all know that law is a regulation. Law is an incentive system. Recently, it got killed in the courts, but Lake Erie was seen as having its own rights, like, the side of rights of nature. I think we should really be pushing things in much more concerted efforts to not just say, I like that we're going to change the human condition at Georgia Tech, but I would much prefer that we were more inclusive than that, than just the human condition, right? There's lots of unhuman or animals, insects. We know the insect apocalypse is upon us. I would like us to be actually much more inclusive of what we say we're doing at Tech relative to that kind of outcome.
That was a great ending. Great note to finish on. I know we're close to running out of time, and I wanted to give some time for questions. Sounds like we have a question.
I'll wait for the mic.
If we look at the built environment, we see that this is an area where persistent inequalities continue to to follow the different trends of market flows and all that. So I was wondering, for many years, we would make a reading of Atlanta as a very affordable city in comparison to other cities in the nation. How, from a business and also from an urban development, from an international affairs perspective, do we see these affordable housing issues that also get I think the problems also get worse once we also have short rentals as a marketing factor. Like, for example, the fact that many people in many historical cities in Europe can no longer live there because of the short rentals. So, or it happens also where I come from in Puerto Rico, where a lot of people are going, trying to find a house to rent because they are, they have a family, they need to their young, families emerging, and they are unable to find these options. So how could we also create some strategies to develop engagements with different stakeholders to at least start a conversation on these issues?
Ooh, where to start? You have to- Okay.
I'll take a really quick crack at it, but I have to say affordable housing is a global issue. I mean, the existence of informal settlements in Mumbai and Nairobi are all about housing affordability. It is true that Atlanta has moved from being what we thought it was our competitive edge, actually Georgia Tech, right? We had affordable housing, to it's very hard to find an affordable house here. And I think one of the issues, just to go back to, this sort of fundamental societal side of it, is we've become much more accepting of inequality in American society and perhaps globally even since I've been alive, right? I mean, the United States was its peak most equal in the 1950s, and we've just been on the trajectory to a more unequal place ever since. And so we walk by homeless people and we accept it, right? I mean, it's extraordinary. In order to address affordable housing, it would need like an all points, everything being brought to bear. In the American system, for instance, we have premised our housing production on providing housing for the most well-off. And then as the house deteriorates, it supposedly becomes more affordable and people can have access. We have never done a very aggressive model of, in fact, addressing this as market failure, which most economists say market failure is a thing, right? That's why you intervene as a government, and saying we need to actually put major money into addressing housing and not just have a few lame tax instruments, the low-income housing tax credit, our main instrument. It's very hard to get. It only builds very few units, and it builds for people at like 80% AMI, area median income. We're completely missing extraordinary people in needs, including people on the streets. And right now, it looks like the Supreme Court is probably going to uphold the case law out of the Pacific Northwest, out of Klamath Falls, that says, yes, you as a city have the right to clear people and just shove them off land and not actually necessarily have to give them any place to go. So affordable housing, to me, it's actually very close and dear to my heart, is a huge conundrum. And we need businesses, but businesses have to have the right type of incentive structures for doing it. We need really great corporate funding, or I'm sorry, public funding. And we need to have a conversation about what it means to have a decent life and the responsibility of us as a society to provide people what they need. Okay, sorry, it was a little bit of a, yeah, what do you call it? I'm preaching.
I love that. Thank you. I think there's one more question. So I wanted to, we're almost out of time, Stuart? Okay.
Quickly, in the previous panel, the moderator invited us to think about, noted the difference and invited us to think about the difference between sustainability and sustainable development, right? And so there was a kind of an initiation to explore that, but we did not get that far. But with this panel, I think is bringing this question back even in stronger ways, I think. And so as someone who is coming from other areas of scholarship and work, I am curious to know about the status of the discussion on the questions on sustainability scholarship and work, about the question whether it is possible to have not only sustainable development still, but sustainable capitalism or sustainable colonialism. Because it would seem that this notion of sustainability seems to be malleable, ambiguous enough that it would allow, potentially it seems, different readings of and ways of approaching and conducting operations around sustainability that advance rather than counter capitalism and colonialism. What is the status of the discussion around that in the scholarship in your areas?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah. There's a lot of
It's a
ways
good one.
Yeah, that's a tough one and really interesting one. I mean, I guess, my quick answer would be that, I think with the sustainable development goals and with the rhetoric around that, I mean, I think it's really normalized this kind of idea that, you can achieve sustainability and development, at the same time, and that's what kind of should be done. I think in practice, there is a tension, right? And I think that I wanted to just pick up on what Michael said about short and long term. We see the same things with policymakers, right? And so oftentimes, one of the core tenets in political science is, politicians make decisions or policymakers make decisions with a view to the next election, right? So that inherently, promotes short-sighted thinking. And so when we're talking about, capitalism or development, right, there is this incentive to kind of prioritize what can be seen more, in the short term versus in the long term. So, I mean, I think that there is probably, in a lot of realms, it's not that easy to achieve, kind of, I would say, sustainable capitalism or even sustainable development. But I think that, just increasingly what's just been happening in the world has shown us that it's really important to try or, to have that as a goal, even though that might be kind of really difficult in practice. But that's just my.
Sure.
Oh,
That's a really important question. I don't think I'm qualified to speak about sort of where we are on the scholarship side of things, but from a business perspective, again, I'm going to share both an optimistic and pessimistic view at the same time. Optimistically, as I said earlier, there's this growing sustainability focused ecosystem among all of the major stakeholders that make capitalism what it is, right? And trying to infuse sustainable principles into that. The challenges of that are several. I mean, one is I do like the term ESG to a certain degree, environmental social governance criteria that investors look at when they're addressing sustainability with companies. I like it because it breaks down the term sustainability into something a little bit more understood. We're talking about these three major categories of issues. Now, it has to be broken down much further than that within a company, because the company has to understand which issues, where it has influence, where it has impact, and where it can contribute to, for example, to the SDGs. But there's barriers to that. I mean, one of the barriers are the same barriers that we face here at Georgia Tech, which are just silos. You have in companies, especially large companies, you have the community relations folks in one department, you have the environmental folks in another department, and they often don't realize that they're working either in conflict or they're not. They would have better impact if they collaborated. And again, that comes back to sort of the notion of short-termism. So I guess the opportunity is enormous as we unpack sustainability for business and as business makes it relevant to itself, which I've seen an increasing amount of. But we have such a long way to go as well. So there's the optimism, and the pessimism is that climate change and the urgency surrounding it, the environmental justice issues that flow from it, businesses are behind. And businesses, one last barrier is that when we talk about ESG, businesses are not comfortable with the S because they can't quantify it. So if I want to go to my CEO and make a case for addressing community-related issues, I'm going to be sent to the philanthropic arm of the company, rather than sort of the core business and what can we do as a core business to make this community or the communities that we impact better. But they don't have a way of quantifying sort of the impact for them as a business. Whereas environmental issues, you can build spreadsheets around that, which makes them feel more comfortable. So again, my mixed, we're doing great, we're doing awful, sort of feeling on the topic.
Stuart, are we done at, I want to give everyone a chance to say one more thing real quick. Is that okay? So in summary, I'd like to just close it out with one sentence from each of you on just one sentence. So think as I ask this, what is your top recommendation for integrating interdisciplinary approaches into education, policy, and businesses to achieve long-term sustainability?
Do you want me to?
Sure.
What was the first one? Education, policy, and business?
integrating interdisciplinary approaches into education policy and business to achieve long-term sustainability. So you can answer it from your perspective. You don't have to add in the business, but just kind of in one sentence, what would be your top recommendation? That's still needed.
Me first?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
All right. Okay. So, I think just to kind of be able to understand, the perspectives of all the different actors that play a role in long-term sustainability, whether it's, kind of citizens, firms, architects, policymakers, and I think that it really requires an interdisciplinary approach, like we have on this panel, to be able to understand, where each of these actors is coming from, and then kind of integrate those challenges and opportunities and incentives.
So,
There it is. I'll speak to education. I think for me, the more interdisciplinarity we have in the classroom, the better. We've done joint studios, say with aerospace engineering and architecture. They don't usually meet each other. We have a VIP looking at disability technology in Rwanda that has BME, public policy, industrial design, architecture. The kids are great. They learn from each other. They really get each other's perspectives. And long-term, joint problem solving is what we need in order to address sustainability. You already have your mic.
Okay.
Not handing it to you.
So I would just say, I agree with the two perspectives that were just been offered. And I would just add the other I word, which is infusion. So interdisciplinary, but also infusing sustainability related concepts into whether it's engineering disciplines or business disciplines or whatever the case may be. And then also having external stakeholders pay attention. So as one example of that, as a business school, we're now, the Financial Times, for example, is ranking business schools. One of their criteria is around their focus on societal impact and how they demonstrate that. So that's a motivator. We don't pay attention to rankings officially, but we do. And that provides a pressure point that I think is a very useful one for us to leverage.
All right. Thank you. Great answers. Thanks to all of our panel. I think it's a coffee break.